All right, we'll get started. It's just a couple minutes after 3, but it's great to see everyone here. My name is Amy O'Sullivan, and I'm thrilled to be here today as an alumni of the Masters of Applied Positive Psychology program and as a presenter of this webinar series, Strategies to Thrive in Uncertain Times. I want to first thank the Alumni Association for providing us with this opportunity to connect, to learn, and to practice the scientific strategies of positive psychology. I also want to applaud all of you. I keep saying this in webinars lately, but it's one thing to sign up for virtual learning, an entirely different level of commitment to show up at 3 p.m. on a Wednesday in the middle of a pandemic. And because you showed up, it may be because there's something about this topic that you think you need to hear, or perhaps that you'll learn something that will be beneficial in helping you navigate these times. Or maybe more broadly, that you're needing and wanting to invest in your well-being and your sanity right now. So whatever the reason may be, I want to thank you. But more importantly, maybe you should thank you. When we are talking today about softening the stance towards self or self-compassion, or what I will refer to as inner resilience, I want to make clear that this is not a novel or innovative approach. In fact, I am just re-exposing you to the research of the experts in this field, because we know that repetition, exposure, practice is what enables us to more easily apply it in our life. There will be questions and answers that you can ask throughout, but they will be addressed at the end. So what are we doing here today? We're going to start off by bringing awareness and understanding to the human stress response, why we react the way that we do under uncertain and chaotic, demanding life circumstances. We'll talk about emotions and the broad spectrum of human emotions, all of them, and what Lori Gottlieb, a psychotherapist, will say, the weather system of emotions. I will then provide the 3 components of inner resilience, or self-compassion, adopt the language that resonates with you, and I will address the fears and the resistance to this approach. Quite quickly after, I will combat that with the facts of inner resilience and the scientific data that tells us why we should entertain this practice. Somewhere in there, I'll throw in a reflective activity for us all to practice. You should be able to leave this webinar today having greater understanding and compassion for why you may be reacting the way that you are right now, with the 3 tangible components of inner resilience and ways to apply them, and with a plethora of empirical evidence to reinforce why to entertain and apply this practice. Bear with me as I present a seemingly trivialized metaphor for what we're all going through. But I imagine about 6 months ago, there was a degree of certainty and predictability in your profession or in your life, and you knew when timelines or deadlines were required, or the demands of your life and how to manage them. And if you've ever been for a hike or a walk or a run through a familiar trail, you know where to go right and you know where to go left. You know where the twists and the turns of the trail are and where it gets a little bit more damp after a night of rain. And if there's a degree of which you can predict what comes next in the trail, you can have that ease and comfort of having some control over what's next. But if you've ever taken a wrong turn in the middle of your trail and clouds roll in or thunder strikes, you may notice that your mind goes to a very different place. It may start to think, what time is it? Where am I anyway? How long is it going to take me to get home? Who's in this park anyhow? And those thoughts arise because your environment has changed. And what's happened to all of us is our environments have changed. We are now faced with unpredictability and uncertainty. We don't know when it's going to end or what's next. The demands might seem new and more difficult to handle. And a common theme is that we beat ourselves up for the way that we're responding to this. I shouldn't think this, I shouldn't feel this, I shouldn't react this way. But actually, based on evolutionary adaptation, that's exactly how you should be responding. It was probably just yesterday where you ran into a saber-toothed tiger. That is a joke, my friends. But the truth is, our great ancestors were running from saber-toothed tigers. And if they didn't run, you and I wouldn't be here. So thank goodness they did. But because they did, they ingrained a hardwiring within our brain called the negativity bias. And this is a predisposition that makes us detect threats far more frequently than pleasures. It's a survival instinct, and it protects us when we're facing real threats, like the virus. But the problem is our body and our mind also react this way when we're dealing with perceived threats. And this affects us mentally, emotionally, and physically. Physiologically, you might begin to feel that you have pale or flushed skin. Some people experience hearing loss or dry mouth. Others of us tremble, shake, sweat. The heartbeat gets rapid, short, and shallow. Digestion will slow because who needs to worry about digestion if you're fighting for your life? Pupils dilate. We experience tunnel vision where literally our peripheral view gets limited. And again, we have that mental experience of what if. And all of the what ifs tend to be through the lens of worst case scenarios. And this is beneficial when we're surviving. But when we're trying to live and perform and respond our best, it's not exactly optimal. In 1908, psychologists Yerkes and Dawson determined the energy level needed for optimal performance. They saw this inverted U, where we need a certain amount of energy in order to be our best. A renowned sports psychologist, Dr. Craig Seifer, put in these color categories to better identify when we're on and when we're off. Use those terms lately. But essentially, when we enter into the stress response, we can find ourselves in a gray zone or in a red zone. A gray zone might look like lack of motivation, exhaustion, burnout, and the red zone might look like anxiety or overwhelm or worry. Our green zone is energized and focused and concentrated and a sense of contentment. And I think there's a misconception around this, that if we are in a gray zone or if we find ourselves in a red zone, that we just have to ride the wave. But what we know is that you can move from a gray or a red zone to a green zone. And the reason why we think this way is I imagine if you've ever woken up and felt exhausted, the gray zone, you think, I just got to get through this day. Or right now, as we are embarking on COVID-19 times, you might say, I'm just going to feel stressed out or worried or anxious until this time ends. But there are scientific backed strategies that enable us to move from a gray zone or a red zone to a green zone within moments. And that's what we'll be talking about today. Inner resilience or self-compassion is one of those empirically backed strategies to get you back to your optimal zone of functioning. Oftentimes when I present on energy level versus performance arousal or performance levels, people go to these conclusions that gray zone and red zones, feelings and emotions are bad, and we have to get rid of them. How can I not experience any more gray zones or red zones? But I really quickly want to clarify that all of these emotions are human, and there's not right ones or wrong ones. And what we know is that there's one emotional pipeline, which means if we're resisting or denying or suppressing the harder felt emotions, we're also limiting our capacity to experience the pleasant ones, the life-giving ones. So like the weather, we're going to have refreshing, crisp, winter wonderland days. And we're going to have gusty, overwhelming, windy days. And there's going to be torrential downpour where it feels like too much, too soon, too fast. And we're going to have joy and gratitude and connection. And none is better than the other. We're not trying to change the emotions that you have as a human being, but rather change the way that we relate to the emotions and the way that you relate to yourself while you're experiencing those emotions. In fact, it takes the body roughly 1.5 minutes to process an emotion. But when was the last time you felt one of those windy or torrential downpour days, anger or frustration or irritability for just 1.5 minutes? And it is prolonged and sustained because of this resistance and denial and because of the way we relate to ourselves and relate to the emotion as it arises. So what Dr. Kristen Neff, the leading researcher in self-compassion and inner resilience, tells us is that there are 3 components to relate to ourselves differently during times of adversity. And the first component is mindfulness. You may be someone who doesn't want to hear the word mindfulness again, right? It's on every magazine, or you see another book that says be here now, and you're going to totally tune out. But it is the foundation of everything we're about to talk about. And that is because in Western society, we don't spend time naming or moving towards our suffering. We move into solutionizing and fixing and controlling and changing. Adam Grant, an organizational psychologist and professor at Wharton Business School, will stand in front of workplaces and pose to the audience to fill in the blank. He will say, your supervisor, your boss will say, don't come to me with blank, come to me with blank. And the entire audience, without hesitation, will respond back, don't come to me with problems, come to me with solutions. We have been trained and taught to fix and solutionize. And when we do that, we dismiss and invalidate that there's even something challenging here. And what we're inviting through this mindfulness is not to over-identify with the emotional experience, but to hold space in an open-hearted way to say, this is hard. There is something challenging here. This rainy day has rain in it. This windy day has wind in it. Right? And naming and coming closer to our suffering rather than controlling and manipulating it. The next step is common humanity. And at this point, we're identifying that being human means we're going to struggle. We are going to go through adversity and challenges. And it is not abnormal to have that. In fact, it is very normal. It is part of our shared human experience. And again, we know this, but when we're in the moment of having a tough time, Neff will say that we become very egocentric. We think I'm the only person that's struggling. I'm the only person that's going through this. And that sense of isolation actually propels us back into that fight or flight state. Instead, we're saying it's actually part of common humanity to struggle. And lastly, what I call inner resilience, as Neff calls self-compassion, is posing the question of how are we to ourselves? Are we for us or against us? Are you somebody that is whipping yourself like a jockey on a horse, telling you to go faster and harder and stronger? And if so, how is that working for you? We have family and friends that will be with us, hopefully, for the majority of our life. But you're the only person that's going to be with you every moment for the rest of your life. So again, I pose the question, how are you being to you? And how is it working for you? We have ingrained beliefs that we need beating up, that we need whipping and harsh judgment in order to succeed. And the science tells us the exact opposite, that we need to treat ourselves the way we would a dear friend. And actually, that's the most contrasting way to look at it, is to think about how you show up for other people, what language you use, what tone, what demeanor, what do you say to encourage and support them? And how different is that from the way that you show up for yourself? And if soothing and caring and concerning is a little bit too mushy language for you, then I'm just asking that we invite treating yourself with decency and respect and justice that you would another person. One of the simplest examples is if you are down on the ground, are you going to get back up faster and better if someone lends you a hand or if you start kicking yourself? It seems obvious, but we stay on this pathway of criticizing and condemning just about everything we do. And instead of talking about these components of mindfulness, common humanity, and inner resilience, I think we'll just practice a little bit. And so this is a self-reflective activity. I'm not going to ask that you close your eyes or that you get in any type of seated position. I'm just going to ask that you call to mind, or in layman's terms, think about what I present. So starting off, I want you to think about a friend right now that has come to you and discussed a difficult part of this time period. What did they say to you was hard for them? What were the details of the challenge for them? How did they speak to you? What feelings were they sharing? What feelings did you have hearing this? And then I want you to think about what you said to them. how you showed up for them, how you supported them, how you encouraged them. What was your tone? What was your demeanor? What was your language? What do you tell someone when you're trying to pick them up and soothe their suffering instead of exacerbate it? And then letting that go. And as you can imagine, we're going to reflect this back towards self. And I want you to call to mind or think about a hard part of these circumstances and this time for you. Doesn't have to be the hardest part, but something that's challenging for you in a change of environment. What are the details around it? How does it make you feel? And we're going to integrate the 3 components here. So the first one is just having a moment of coming near the suffering, of naming it, of saying, this is really hard, or I'm really struggling, and not needing to react or change or fix it right now, but just knowing that you see it. And the second part is just saying that it's not abnormal. This is part of being human. And we all are going to struggle and we all are going to suffer. And yes, we have different degrees, or as Neff says, different flavors of suffering. But it is very much part of our human condition to go through adversity and to have a hard time. And then lastly, with the same tone and the same language that you reflected on what you would tell a friend, I want you to be there for you. I want you to be for you instead of against you. What do you need to hear? How can you soothe and soften your suffering instead of exacerbate it? What's the tone? What's the language? What's the way you encourage and motivate you to get back up? And just kind of letting that activity go. At the end, I'll kind of ask if anyone has opinions or wants to share what that was like for you. But oftentimes that can be a foreign or uncomfortable feeling because we haven't showed up for ourselves in that way. And I always like to call to mind the fact that this doesn't have to be just during adversity. I don't know about you, but I've certainly had the experience of beating myself up for feeling okay right now. Right? So it's not that we just have to be in the torrential downpour or in the gusty, windy day to give ourselves inner resilience and respect and compassion. But right now, when there's a universal problem, do we give ourselves permission to have gratitude in sunny days and refreshing, crisp, calm days? And part of that is also having the compassion and having the support that those are allowed too right now. If you think about a friend coming to you and said, I got to connect with family more over this time, where it's been such a nice slowing down of pace and I can meditate and get my house in order, would you beat them up? And so knowing that not only are these positive emotions okay, but they're life-giving. Dr. Barbara Fredrickson, a leading researcher in positive emotions, says that they broaden our awareness and they build our resources. That means they do the exact opposite than that fight or flight response. They build the resources of resilience and optimism, of creativity, cognitive flexibility, and problem solving. They expand our social connections and they improve sleep quality and immunity. You may have also thought while I was talking about this, but what if I don't do anything? What if this practice doesn't work for me? And your fears are not abnormal. Actually, more than 90% of people report their fears keep them from approaching themselves this way. So what may those fears be? Some people think it's selfish, or it'll become self-serving if they're more nurturing, kind, and respectful to themselves. Most people think they'll get lazy, that they will spend the rest of their life watching Netflix on their couch if they're not whipping themselves into shape. They'll become weak or soft and lack drive, ambition, or motivation. They'll become self-indulgent or self-pitying. And I want to validate those fears while quickly combating them with what we know from research and science. The facts of the practice tell us that people have higher well-being and psychological functioning when they're for themselves instead of against. They have healthier responses to stress, which means they get from those red or their gray zones back to the green zone faster and better when they're supportive to them. They have lower levels of oppression, anxiety, and rumination, higher life satisfaction, greater resilience, positive affect, emotional intelligence, and intellectual flexibility, higher levels of optimism, which we know is a protective factor for lifelong age, and increased capacity for compassion with others, where we learn just then, if we want to be compassionate with others, it starts with ourselves. And that, in knowing all these details, it's not like we're going to turn off the Godzilla hardwiring of our brain. But what we're trying to do here is be able to start to ingrain a pathway so that you could support yourself if you wanted to, so that you could be there when you need you the most. And so that's done by commitment to speaking and being there differently than before. And so I invite gentle nudges in your day, whether that's setting an alarm and having it say, am I for me or against me once a day? Or how are you being to you? Or just self-compassion or inner resilience, or whatever language resonates with you, but getting a gentle nudge to approach yourself differently. For those of you who have really harsh critics or really tough jockeys on the horse, I invite you to wear a rubber band or a hairband on your wrist. And when you notice the inner critic picking up fuel, you have to start snapping the rubber band. So with those negative, harsh judgment thoughts, you snap the rubber band. And the challenge here is to rebuttal it with language that you would give to someone you love, to language that you would give to someone you're trying to motivate, pick up, support, and soothe their suffering. And then another suggestion that we didn't really dive deeply into today is saturating and savoring the support that other people give you. That inner critic creates barriers from the positive reinforcement we get from other people. And part of planting the seeds in our hardwiring is to be open and receptive to hear the good support and to really savor what it's like to get that from other people. So Dr. Shawna Shapiro will say that this is a lot for people. It's like I have operated on this way of asking more of myself and demanding more and being hard on myself for a long time. And asking them to go 150% in is a lot. And that's not what I'm asking today. In fact, I'm just asking that you dip your toe in, that we go 5% in, that we give yourself an opportunity to be there for you when you need you the most. If this concept and this research was important 5 years ago or 6 months ago, it is that much more important today. And so with that, I thank you all for being here. I thank you for entertaining the practice and for planting a little bit of those seeds and combating your inner Godzilla. And I will open it up now for questions and answers.
Hey, so Amy, Alexandra wants to know if they are able to have access to the PowerPoint afterwards.
I will see if that can be posted with it, but there's a recording to all of this that you'll find on the MAPP alumni, so you can replay it at your own pace.
Okay, great.
Any questions? Thank you, Elaine. I'm so glad you can make it.
Okay, so Emily is asking you what has been the biggest lesson that you have learned about self-compassion in your own practice?
I think that it's a practice, right? And so we'll practice this and sometimes feel immediately like, I can't believe I'm still this awful to myself when I know all of this, when I know that I'm more productive and that my motivation is more sustainable if I'm kinder to myself. And then comes back in that inner critic. And instead of beating myself up, it's time to practice again. And so what the practice tells us is that it's repetition and it's ongoing. And I think for me, that's humbling, that I'm never going to, master this, but that's okay, because part of it is we're combating against our biological hardwiring. But every time we go back to being more compassionate and inner resilient for ourselves, we're starting to give ourselves equal opportunity to balance out the way that we address ourselves.
Great. Amanda also would like to know if you have any self-compassion books that you recommend.
Yeah, I have tons, and I can send them directly to you. I'll go to the next slide. If you email me directly, I'll send you a bunch of resources that tend to be from Kristin Neff, because she is just the expert in this field, but I will send you all of those, so I'd be happy to share you books, websites, and some practices as well.
Great. Another question is they're wanting to know if you can expand on self-compassion and transitioning from like the gray to red zone and into the green zone.
Yeah, I always go back to this renowned sports psychologist, Craig Seifer, put in those color categories. For me, they're like life-changing. And one of the big things is that when we're in the gray or the red zones, oftentimes our thoughts and the way we're relating to our experience keep us there. And so by relating to ourselves differently, it helps either motivate us, it helps shift our emotions quicker, and that way it can move us back to your optimal zone of functioning. And you can think about that as much as like, if you are having stress and overwhelm and nerves during this time and finding yourself in that red zone, if you keep beating yourself up for being there, that resistance and that denial of those emotions is going to keep you there. But if you relate to yourself differently in that state, that's what gets us back to a green zone. And we think of that as our optimal zone of functioning.
Great. Gina wanted to let you know that thank you, and that she needed to hear this through the hard time that she's going through.
Thanks so much for being here, Gina, of course. And then I see, Anna, do you see this one from Alexandra saying, how do you handle the belief that if you practice self-compassion, you are indulging?
Yes.
And I think that's where the contrast between the support we give to other people and the support we give to ourselves really helps. Would you think it's indulging for someone else to be kind to themselves? Or when you give them that support or encouragement, are you expecting them to start indulging? Right? And I think being able to relate to the way you show up for other people and acknowledge and fact check that that's not indulging. That's actually just decency. That's just respect. That's just justice for being human, right? And so if this kind and soothing and caring and concerned language kind of resists you, there's much more normalizing language that still allows us to see that we are deserving of being treated with respect and encouragement and justice. And that's what self-compassion offers, as well as the soothing, comforting, and nurturing side of it.
Great.
I also think the more you indulge in it, the less it feels like indulgence. And I shouldn't say indulge, but the more that you practice it, the less you realize it isn't indulgence. We're just going against, that ingrained belief often.
So Alexandra is responding to you as you gave that answer, that she said that she's afraid that she would be lowering her standards and then would be unhappy with herself. So what do you think about that?
I think that sometimes I don't always like to use science as the reason why we do something, because then we're kind of attached to the results that science provide for us. But it's really important to be able to tune in some of Kristin Neff's research that shows us that people that are compassionate actually achieve their goals quicker and faster and more readily, that they have more motivation, and more sustained motivation. We also think of this, you know, cracking the whip as a quick fix, but sustained motivation happens through more of this compassionate and a resilient way of approaching the self. So most people achieve higher expectations and higher goals when they approach themselves this way than the opposite. But that is a common fear. That's kind of why we named it, that people think they become lazy or not reach their goals.
Yeah. Alexandra's responding back to you again. She said that when she started reading the book years ago, that she had to put it aside because she was starting to feel nauseous, that this is how she knew she needed it, you know, that it was a sign that that was, you know, that she needed it more than anything. I guess as far as, you know, what you're speaking to with the resilience.
Yeah. I think whenever we feel a little bit uncomfortable or it feels foreign to talk to ourselves in this manner, it's just important to acknowledge why, right? And often that's maybe because we need it more than ever. And that doesn't mean, like, even when we reflected on a difficult part of this time period, it wasn't to call to mind the hardest part, right? Because that can feel really overwhelming to relate to with compassion. But the purpose is to be able to start to gently nudge yourself to more of this soothing way of relating to your hardships or your suffering, not at the highest extreme, but eventually get there so that you can show up that way for yourself amongst all struggle. Any other questions? You're welcome, Yolande. Great that you're here. And Amanda Maffa, self-compassion books. Yeah, there's tons. Anything written by Kristen Neff or Chris Germer, I would recommend. But I will also, if you email me at the email that's on the slide now, amy@growthgame.com, I will send you self-compassion books, websites, practices, like a tips and tricks sheet that I'd be happy to share with you. It's going to be labeled under inner resilience because that happens to be the language that resonates with people more, but I'm happy to share that. Any other questions?
Elaine is asking if you could say a bit more about compliments.
Yeah, so I think that if we talk about like confirmation bias, we detect things that confirm what we already believe about ourselves, right? And so if we have this ingrained pathway of criticizing, having harsh judgment and demanding and condemning ourselves, well, then we almost block out a lot of the compliments or positive reinforcement that we get, or even the support and encouragement that we get. And so part of self-compassion is not only being there for yourself, but also opening yourself up to be more receptive to the support that other people provide for you and being able to hear it, absorb it, take it in and savor it so that it really can have the benefit of which someone is offering to you.
Great. And Larissa wanted to tell you that she remembers taking Kristen Neff's self-compassion test and she beat herself up after scoring so badly. So what would you say in response to that?
Yeah, Larissa, I'm so glad you brought that up. We didn't talk about it, but you know, in self-compassion or in inner resilience, we're not beating ourselves up for beating ourselves up, right? And there's no goal here. And sometimes, again, it's humbling to come back to that. We were genetically wired to criticize, you know, to detect the negative things and the things that we're doing wrong. And so we're kind of going against the grain. And can we have compassion with learning to be compassionate with ourselves? This isn't a switch that we just flip and we're able to relate to ourselves and our experiences different immediately. And so I come back to it being a practice, but also having compassion for yourself when you can adopt it right away, when it needs easing into. And that's why I kind of give the spectrum and the range of language. Some people can dive right into, you know, care and concern and kindness and love for the self. Other people just stay on the side of decency and justice. And then we have in the middle, which is like comfort and concern. And you find language at first to kind of essentially, at some point, move the meter to get you more towards that nurturing approach. But it's a practice, and I would really recommend people take it lightly as you learn to do this practice.
Great. Yes, language was a very good reframe for her. She said to tell you thank you.
Of course, Larissa, I'm so glad you're here. Elaine, thank you. Cecilia, Amanda, all my Mapsters. I love that you're here. I've got some Terps from Maryland on here. I love that you're here. Friends, family, and then just people that want to learn. So I appreciate you all tuning in today. I wish you all health and safety during this time. If you have any questions or you want any recommendations, feel free to email me after the fact. But until next time, and stay well.